Another term I'd like to say that we talk about treating patients. We should talk about treating people. We treat human beings. That is most important. It's just not that the patient walks into a door with a toothache and you want to address that toothache and they go. Increase awareness.
Yeah.
Just telling the patient that you need a scaling is not good enough.
Exactly.
You have to show them why they need the treatment, what is the need, and definitely the patients will then readily accept your treatment.
Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dental News Podcast and welcome to our pain management and dentistry series. Today we have a dentist whose career literally exemplifies excellence in so many dimensions of dentistry. We have Dr. Ninit Bande with us, ladies and gentlemen, who is a graduate of Harvard School of Dental Medicine as well as Harvard School of Public Health. She has also played a very instrumental role in establishing so many residency programs and internship programs across Pakistan and UAE as well. She has also worked with one of the leading cancer institutes of world as well and completed her residency at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I can go on and on, but let's hear from the legend herself. Dr. Ninit, thank you so much for taking out the time for this. I'm so honored to have you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mariam, for your nice introduction. But before I go on further, I just want to add that I'm originally a graduate from Liaquat Medical and Dental College, Jamshoro. And that's where I started my career. And then took me to Harvard and wherever. But
Absolutely.
I started
Thank you
my
so much for adding that.
Okay.
Thank you. It's my bad I missed it. So we will definitely talk about that journey in great detail. But first I want to build it step by step. I want to understand where the motivation even came from to join dentistry back in the day when you joined it. It must have been so new, the concept and just the awareness. So why did you pursue dentistry?
See, dentistry is a field which gives you the unique opportunity with a combination of artistry, science, and also allows you to do a lot of precision. And it just does not allow you to treat oral health, but gives you the opportunity to treat the patient, improve their confidence, their quality of life. And I enjoyed working with my hands. So, of course, that was the area that I selected. And I should also comment that it was also my parents' wishes.
Right.
In those days, the parents would tell you that, this is a good profession for you and you do it. And we would follow. It's unlike today, like where our children want to do what they want to do. But we have to guide them. I think at that age when we are so young, so immature, their guidance really helps because we didn't have much exposure or much opportunities in those days.
Dr. Ninit, weren't you ever like unsure about the kind of career opportunities that dentistry would open for you, considering there must not have been that much advancement at that time, etc.?
See, that time, the only dental college in the whole province of Sindh was in Jamshoro. So we had no Bakai, no Fatma Jinnah, and all. So that was, if you wanted to do dentistry, you had to travel 135 or X number of miles to and live in the dorm because you couldn't commute every day. But I always felt that was an area where I enjoyed when you give patients smile, when I thought, and I saw my mom getting her treatment done and getting her smile. It built the confidence. You just become a different person.
Absolutely.
And so that's how I
So now I want to jump to my favorite question. So like, what landed you from all the way from Jamshoro to Harvard? How did this transition even happen?
You see, when I was in Jamshoro, all I had to do was study. I had nothing else to do. There was no other family life or no other social life also.
Okay.
So all you did was education, study. So we studied, lived in the dorm, lived in the dorm and studied. So I was the best graduate throughout my career over there. And then I always wanted to choose the best. I wanted to be at the top. So I then selected the best colleges where I applied. Before I got my admission at Harvard, they asked me to come and attend a summer school because they weren't sure at the level of my education, of my knowledge. So I did a 2-month summer school there, and they were shocked how I could speak English because I was the first dental student in the school The university had many students in the past, but as a dental student in the school, I was there first.
Right.
So they were a little shocked how I could speak such beautiful English, and so you had to tell them that their perception of Pakistan and our education was
Right.
different. Yes, I was exposed to a lot of things which I had not seen here in the school. So like, they talked about, you see a furnace and you saw all this stuff that was in the labs, which was like fairy tale here, because we were taught, but we had never seen
Never
those
seen,
equipment
exactly.
or those basic equipment that allowed you to do all the procedures.
Right.
So I really enjoyed my trip. It was an eye opener.
So which courses did you?
I was in the Department of Restorative Dentistry,
ठीक है.
and of course, once you are in any university, it gives you the opportunity to go over any area that you would
Exactly.
like to increase your scope of practice.
That must have been so rewarding, the entire experience in itself. So you were mentioning some key areas in Harvard that you found different from here. I mean, I'm sure there must be many, but you just mentioned that there were established labs, etc., and generally the concepts and the things or equipment that you used to study over here, you could actually firsthand see them or use them.
See, unfortunately, we had the equipment maybe, but it was not functional. And that is
Okay.
one thing that you see that a lot of investment goes into the equipments in these colleges, but at those days there was nobody to make it functional, to show us how you use a porcelain furnace, or how in those days. I'm talking about in the
Right.
early 80s or late 70s.
Late 70s.
So,
Wow. Wow.
So,
okay.
not that I want to tell you about my age, but that's exactly the time.
You never know,
So-
maybe you were 16 years old when you went, who knows?
So, you wanted to see, and then you saw that, like root canals. We were doing root canals, but root canals under with a microscope. We had heard about it, but there you really got the opportunity to practice.
You
it.
had a microscope in 1970s? That is incredible.
Yes, it was not as advanced over there, but
Of course,
sure.
but the fact that it did
Yes, yes,
exist,
yeah.
that's absolutely incredible. Okay, so Dr. Nanit, I have a question. You were in the School of Public Health at Harvard as well, right? So I want to understand that because you didn't leave clinical practice even though you graduated from public health. So how did your learning in public health translate to your clinical
See,
practice?
when you are in any university, you have to explore and take the maximum what you can. So the School of Public Health was right next door, and to get a master's in public health, all you needed to do was some extra credit hours, like in biostatistics, epidemiology, and research, and that's what I did, so I would continue with my program. I had to take an extra year, and that's what I did, and go to the School of Public Health as part of my training at the dental school. You do evening courses, morning courses, and you work your way around. So the School of Public Health gave you, see, in the dental school you treat a patient. You are learning to be the best in that area or in that field. The School of Public Health gave us the opportunity to learn how to treat communities, how to develop strategies, how to do research, so that the community can benefit. So that was the advantage,
Right.
of
That's
combining
definitely-
the
So
program.
this brings me to my question upon research now. So you have been very keen on researches to the point where you were a part of a very famous cancer research institute. I'm forgetting the name, but I have this written down. actually.
Dana-Farber.
Yes, Dana-Farber. So I have multiple questions from here, but my first question is, what importance do you think research holds in the life of a clinician?
Okay. See, it's absolutely very important. There is no doubt. See, not every dentist has to be a researcher, but every dentist has to know how to read the literature, how to review the literature. And also, normally when we talk about research, we usually relate it to doing projects with hamsters or animals, and so that is the concept we have. But that's
Yeah.
not true. You can have clinical research. You can do work that you did X number of extractions. How many turn into a dry socket?
True.
Or you did so many X number of implants. How many developed peri-implantitis, or how many were in the upper arch, lower arch, and what was your own success rate. So that's also that is clinical research. So you don't have to do it on an animal project or something.
But Dr. Ninit, so I think this would be possible for somebody who works at a practice continuously, right? But let's say that at an undergraduate level, do you think this is still doable?
Of course, they must. You see, because a lot of it is based on evidence-based practice now. So the research will give you all the data that has been accumulated, and then it's reliable data that you are reviewing, and that helps you get according to the procedure that you want to do in your clinical practice. So that's how you update your knowledge.
Right.
Let's be honest, nobody's going to go back and read 5,000 page textbook. And then also that gets obsolete over a period of time.
Okay, I have a question here. So, Dr. Ninit, often there are research papers which try to prove something or try to hint towards something that is slightly contradictory to what we have read in our conventional textbooks. For example, partial pulpotomy ho gayi or stuff like that. Even though that is present in textbooks now, but still, just for the sake of an example, let's say that there is now a research that is commenting on something that we did not study about in our textbooks. How do you suggest a clinician takes that research into clinical interpretation?
Again, it all depends, number one, whether that research was a sponsored research by a company. Because then if that is the thing, there is some amount of bias. Okay. Or if it is an independent clinical research on some material, and you also have, like clinical trial, you are using X number of materials, and then you will see which is the best for you. So that is very important.
So even to interpret and even to understand, even to adjust a research article that I read in my clinical practice, I have to make sure to check the article.
Exactly, you have to see that, and then what is it based on?
Right, that makes sense.
Is it propagating some X material? You don't want to be biased.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Ninit, my next question is that usually when people take this big of a leap from all the way, let's say, from their hometown to somebody as excellent of somewhere as excellent of a place as Harvard, especially, they don't plan on coming back home. But you did. You came back home. Why? How did that happen? And did you not plan on staying in USA indefinitely, or at least for a longer period of time?
Going to the USA, I was very fortunate that I got the opportunity of going there, which not everybody does, okay? But then you gain the knowledge, you gain everything, but then over there you are one of the many, okay? When you come back home, you bring all the knowledge, you share your knowledge. So you are sharing, you are amongst the few who can contribute more to the country. Initially, I was in Pakistan. I was involved in developing the dental services at the Aga Khan from ground level up. I was their first person to start the department, and then you took it. And now, when I see, even after I've left, it's continuing to grow. It's very, very rewarding and very satisfying. Going to the UAE was another opportunity in my life. So you continue share knowledge, and being a clinician plus an educator. That was my aim. I was always involved in education. I always enjoyed contributing to increasing the scope of clinical practice of the clinicians.
Dr. Ninit, this is so far the most selfless comment that I have heard among so many of my sessions, because I can genuinely not imagine somebody not planning their career around their degree of Harvard and around the country, within the country that they graduated in, especially if it is as developed of a country as USA, right? But I'm very glad that you did make that decision. Otherwise, we might not have had you in front of us today. So I want to talk to you a little bit about your UAE experience as well. When exactly did you move over there, and in what capacity are you working over there exactly?
I moved to the UAE in 2004.
Okay.
And when I moved there, I used to still come back to AKU and contributed to teaching, because we had started the residency program, which was affiliated with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So I continued contributing to that, and of course treating patients until an extended period of time. And in the UAE, I was the head of the dental services for the Department of, at that time it was called the General Authority for Health Services, that was GAS. Then it was converted to HAD, it was renamed to HAD, which is the Health Authority of Abu Dhabi. And then it split into two sections, which was an operatory and regulatory arm. So I continued with the the operatory arm, which was Saha, and I was the head of the dental services of all the outpatient dental clinics of Abu Dhabi and Al Ain. So there it gave me an opportunity to increase the number of clinics, their outpatient clinics, to raise it to another level, and it was a very exciting trip.
It sounds exciting. Like, imagine being in such a great leadership position where you're able to create opportunities for other dentists such as yourself from Pakistan and like across the world, etc. So, Dr. Nat, how would you comment today on the status of general dentistry in UAE exactly, and like, do you think it is a wise idea for Pakistani dentists to pursue going and working?
I think now the trend is going towards specialization.
Sahi.
To be very honest, a general dentist is needed, but you have to go in for specialization. And honestly, in the UAE, that's the trend. They are looking into more specialities, and rather than hiring just general dentists. So you need to specialize in a certain area where you have a better command of your practice, and that's the trend over there.
Right. Okay. I think that's an important information to have, and kind of bursts up necessary bubble.
And just to add, you see, it's not that you only need to go to the United States or UK or X, Y, and Z to get your postgraduate education. We started the education in our own country, in Pakistan. We started the FCPS program, and that is recognized as a specialty. But of course, there are certain requirements that after you graduate, you have to have 2 years of clinical experience, and you take your exams to get your specialty. But this is in any part of the world. If you graduate from here, you want to go to practice in America, you have to take the license exam. So it's exactly like that. It's not that it is not recognized. It is very much recognized, but you have to fulfill the requirements, which is for any part of the world.
Absolutely. Right. So when you went to UAE, exactly, you did what kind of I would say cultural shift did you find in dental practice over there, or was there any, if at all?
There was, and I see a lot of, they had a lot of old school of thought doctors, and we introduced a lot of new trends into infection control, sterilization and stuff, and they were very open. And so that was the best part, and we mandatory BLS training for every clinical practitioner, and there were a lot of procedures you could not perform unless you did not have your own training in that specialty or privileges, right? That I could not go and do any sedation or implantology if you don't have the privilege to do the procedure.
Right.
So that was a different level, and the laws are very good, and this helps you to protects the patient.
Absolutely, that's what I was going to say.
So it is protecting the patients, the community whom we are treating.
Right.
That is the most
absolutely.
important.
And this also sends a wave of motivation among practitioners as well, that because everybody wants to treat patients eventually, but then they would they would have to reach that certain level of credibility and with their credentials, etc.
And another term I'd like to say that we talk about treating patients. We should talk about treating people. We treat human beings. That is most important. It's just not that the patient walks into a door with a toothache and you want to address that toothache and they go. Because there's another whole area when they walk into our door, the patients are in trouble or in pain, and you not only treat to that aspect of the patient, you also want to address the patient as a whole. So you want to go into more comprehensive care so that the patient increase awareness.
Yeah.
Just telling the patient that you need a scaling is not good enough.
Exactly.
You have to show them why they need the treatment, what is the need, and definitely the patients will then readily accept your treatment.
बिल्कुल, आपने ये बहुत अच्छा पॉइंट टच किया, बिकॉज आई थिंक दिस इज़ वेयर सम न्यू डेंटिस्ट्स मे बी लैक समटाइम्स, कि we fail to explain the patient the need of the procedure and what led to this disease in the first place and how they could have prevented it and how they should take care of these things in the future as well. Because then what else is the point of you being a dentist if you can't really educate a patient on oral hygiene. So yes, I'm very glad you touched base on that. Moving on, Dr. Nit, I also want to talk about the establishment of some residency programs and some internship programs in Pakistan that you did, because there were quite many, and you yourself have mentioned a few times now in our conversation that you were very keen on teaching people and you were very keen on becoming an academician and getting into education. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
You see, we were amongst the pioneers to I was fortunate to be part of the development process for the FCPS in Pakistan programs. So we started in different specialities: operative dentistry, oral surgery, orthodontics, prosthetics, and at Aga Khan we started it with the operative dentistry department, where now I think of it, they should have renamed it right at that time as restorative dentistry, because operative dentistry is a very old name. It has finally, I think CPSP has now agreed to change it, but it took them a long time, to do that. But it did help, and then it was like a 2-year program, then evolved into a 3-year, and now I believe it's a 4-year program.
It is a 4-year program.
So, but it is, it is the path to follow. To get into specialization. And there are many institutes, yet instead of developing more undergraduate programs, I think we should go in and develop more postgraduate programs.
Can you tell us some of the challenges that you had at that time while establishing such programs?
There were challenges in the sense that, one problem that we have here is that everybody wants to pick up or point fingers on anything that is not up to the mark. You see, we were all learning at that time. So the curriculum, the examination, how the candidates were being examined, the training itself, there were not adequate slots for the people who finished their part 1 to get into, to complete their part 2. So these were the main challenges. And faculty, because you need dedicated faculty, and see, let us be honest, a lot of areas do not adequately pay you enough. So the salary is not enough. So the doctors or the dentists or the faculty also have to turn to private practice in the evening or the afternoon. So there were challenges, and eventually they were overcome, and I'm glad.
Dr. Nit, I believe some of those challenges even exist today, especially the ones about not having enough training slots available while a lot of people are interested in specializing into a certain field. I believe that challenge exists, and definitely the pay challenge has been overcome significantly, at least in government institutions. However, some other institutions are still struggling to be able to pay their residents the amount that is reasonable for a resident to not have any other thing going on the side. However, I want to understand, because you're one of the founders and of residency programs in Pakistan, what do you think is the appropriate goal for somebody to have while they step into specialization? Should it be gaining their technical skills? Should it be becoming a consultant? What should it be exactly?
See, when you go in for any field, your ultimate goal should be to be at the top. Okay, so if you want to become a prosthodontist, you want to be the best, and not only the best in your clinical area, but also to contribute, to be teachers, leaders, so you can train others, be a good mentor, so people follow you as a role model. So that is most important, that yes, of course you need to know all the best or the latest knowledge of your clinical area, but you have to simultaneously develop yourself as future leaders.
If I was to ask you what thing except technical skills can somebody learn while their specialization or during their clinical career in general, what would you say is that?
See, in our curriculum we lack, we are not taught about communication. We are not taught much about ethics. These are areas, and emotional intelligence of the person himself. We are missing on that. We have to also learn the concept of lifelong learning. So when you finish a program, that does not mean that that's the ultimate goal. You have to continue lifelong learning. Then you have to have the leadership skills, which is something which is developed. And also adaptability, because not necessary that you are in one environment and you have everything available to you. So you have to know how to do the best, but you have to know adapt or see how you can best do whatever you are given with.
Right. So now that you talk about leadership and adaptability, this brings me to my next question, that you have been in multiple leadership positions. You mentioned quite a few while you were explaining your initial journey in UAE. So I want to understand, and correct me if I'm wrong even, but as a woman, do you think your journey in leadership positions or the kind of challenges that you had in leadership positions were unique in any way?
See, leadership comes with challenges. No matter what gender you are.
Okay.
So whether you are a male or a female, it involves a lot of challenges.
Okay.
So one has to learn to overcome these challenges, and if you are strong in your field, I think it is very easy to overcome the challenges. So you don't have to just say that because I'm a woman I cannot do this or not. We have to learn to stand shoulder to shoulder.
Okay, I'm very glad you said that, and it's important. It's important coming from you. But what message would you give to future aspiring dentists, especially female dentists, that look forward to be in such leadership positions, apart from as well as being in their clinical practice too?
See, we should never underestimate ourselves. We should always make sure that we should find good mentors, people who are encouraging you, and all the time you look at someone who is a role model for you, and then you try to follow the steps. So I think that you have to gain your confidence, and you have to develop that within yourself. Nobody will help you do that.
Right. So while you were deciding all these things for yourself, that okay, I am in Jamshoro right now, but you know what, I want to go to Harvard too. And then while you were in Harvard, you decided, I think I want to get back to Pakistan and contribute for my country. And then you went to UAE and made some very significant changes for the better in their system too. So basically, wherever you have been, you did not remain one of the ordinary students or one of the ordinary clinicians, but you tried to find one of the loopholes or one of the areas which were lacking in the field and tried to fill those up. I want to understand, how can somebody have this approach while also not worrying about, okay, oh, this might cost me opportunity to earn or opportunity to learn clinical, or like cost me my clinical hours, etc. Are you getting what I'm saying?
See, what I feel, I was very fortunate, I should say, that I got these opportunities, and I managed to address all these opportunities I'm very happy, and I feel I was successful in whatever in my career, and that was a good opportunity. But you see, what I feel that when we talk about there were times when when I was teaching, you get opposition from consultants that why are you teaching this. You see, even in the UAE, I always had an open door policy. Even when I was at Aga Khan, open door policy. So a young dentist would come and watch what I was doing. I never wanted to close my doors behind.
Okay.
So there was a lot of opposition, because I was established the implantology program with the American Academy of Implant Dentistry in the UAE, and now it's in its 19th year. So
wow.
A lot of consultants who were prosthodontists and oral surgeons, and we opened it up for general practitioners. Say, why do you need to teach? Because then I got all these statistics from all over the world that 80% of the implants are done by general dentists, and the difficult cases, so you have to teach them when to refer, when to do things confidently, and when not to take on a case. So when we had this kind of thing, you were teaching, so I always felt that you shouldn't have something that you have to share your knowledge. You don't want to. And when the consultants would say, why are you doing that? I said, you cannot go with all this knowledge 6 feet under. You better contribute, and you push people to learn. So this is what I feel.
Right. So, Dr. Nir, speaking of dental education, one very important aspect of becoming a good dentist is to learn how to manage a patient, as you said. And while many things come under the definition of managing a patient, managing patient's pain is the most crucial thing. And I think this is something that dentists, at least in the early years, struggle with the most. They don't understand how to deal with different types of pain, whether it's post-op or even pre-op or even while it's during the procedure, etc. So I want to understand, how do you for example, if we talk about extractions, right? Why do you think patients fear extractions primarily because of the pain? Even though I try to always tell my patients that it's not going to be a hurtful procedure if I do it right. But why do you think patients generally associate every dental procedure with pain?
You see, pain itself is a multifactorial concept. It's not just one thing that you can say it's affiliated with or related to extraction or related to root canal.
Sahi baat hai.
But you see, there are many contributing factors to the to the procedure. So the first important, you see, like when the patient walks into the door and you are going to make the procedure so frightful to the patient that just the pain from anxiety is enough for him to go into syncope even before you have just the moment you inject them with little anesthesia. So I think it's very important that we increase the comfort of our patients, something that, when they come into to us in pain especially, you have to examine them, see what is the cause of the pain and try to address that. But just not saying that, but then you still have to explain to the patient what was the cause of the pain, which was a fractured tooth or it was root canal failure or an impacted third molar. So that is how you take it from there. And then you learn how to manage the procedure accordingly.
Okay, because you mentioned impacted third molar, I want to touch base on that too. So how would you suggest a young dentist would be able to differentiate between how they manage a pain that is occurring from impacted third molar versus a pain from surgical extraction or a pain from just a regular extraction, etc.?
Okay, you see, you have to keep in mind there are a lot of contributing factors to the pain associated with that condition. So it can be the surgical procedure. It can be like the patient has, when the procedure you are doing a lot of bone removal, or you're doing, it's an impaction, or there is an associated infection, or there is inflammation. The patient is a smoker. The patient didn't follow your post-operative instructions. So there's a combination of factors, and also the clinical skills of the clinician.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that is most important. So you have to see, we all do extractions, let's be honest. But there are certain extractions which is a horizontal impaction, or something which you need to refer. So you must learn when to refer, when not to do. The thing,
Right. So, in terms of pain management in particular, how do you think when managing pain with different procedures, it works in a similar manner, or do I have to be more careful with one procedure and less careful with another?
I think, sometimes when we talk about extractions, like even a simple extraction can turn into a complicated extraction.
True.
So every procedure you have to take with a pinch of salt, and even if it's a simple first molar extraction, it can be, you can split the root if it's a grossly bombed out tooth, and you can get stuck in it. So you have to plan the procedure. Maybe just not yanking the tooth out. Maybe you want to section the tooth, do an atraumatic extraction. So everything has to be planned. So if you tell the patient from before that it's a bombed out tooth, it's going to fracture in, and you might hear some noises. So you section the tooth from the beginning and make it an atraumatic extraction.
True. Also, that would reduce patients' anxiety significantly too. कि चलें डॉक्टर साहब ने बता ही दिया था कि किरची ही होके निकलेगा. Okay, so let's talk about a scenario in which the procedure is done, right? And now this young dentist, and I keep on saying young dentist because I am very close to young dentists. I consider myself as one as well, even though it's been a while since I graduated. But anyway, now let's consider that the procedure is done, and now that poor dentist has to deal with post-operative complications and post-operative pain, right? What would be your go-to analgesics, for example?
See, Usually, I feel Panadol or paracetamol, they work very well, okay? I use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and they work very well. Sometimes you can use a multimodal approach, and you can combine medication. So you can take ibuprofen plus paracetamol, or
Right.
you know. And I don't go into very elaborate opioids and stuff. I don't give my patients like tramadol or medications like that, because I don't feel like morphine or something, because you don't need. You get patients who, especially in the United States, patients would come in the middle of the night in the emergency when you were on call, and they'll say, I'm in a lot of pain,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they're acting, and they know, and they want an injection of some drug, and because they are drug addicts, and they know that you are new to and in the residency program, and they can manage you,
Yeah.
but you have to know how to give what. So you really for dentistry you don't need that kind of painkillers for the kind of procedures we are doing.
Right.
But usually with sometimes if I've had an impacted third molar, or I've done multiple implants, I give them a stat dose of steroid, prednisolone, corticosteroid, 20 milligrams, 3 tablets, so 60 milligrams
Okay,
stat
okay.
dose, which I give. They dispense it one dose in my after the procedure in
Oh,
the
so you
chair.
do it yourself in
I
the
give
office,
it to
right.
them myself, and they don't need to take that, because that helps take care of the infection. I mean the inflammation,
That
the
makes
pain,
sense.
acute pain.
So I'm very glad you mentioned the topic of opioids, because that is definitely I think it's also self-medication that leads to some of these wrong decisions by patients, because they want to go towards an extreme, right? And this is actually what I wanted to talk about the importance of sticking to basic analgesics and basic painkillers, and not unnecessarily going towards antibiotics, or unnecessarily going towards opioids, etc. But what in your practice have you observed regarding patients' confidence in using antibiotics on their own?
You see, normally, the problem is that when you do a surgical procedure, sometimes it's good to prescribe an antibiotic, sometimes prophylactically, or in the environment they are living, like the kind of water they are drinking or something. But you have to make sure that they understand that it is not a routine practice.
It is not a routine practice.
So, but just for managing pain and inflammation, I use a combination of ibuprofen 600 milligrams with 2 paracetamols every 6 hours for 2 to 3 days, and really takes care of most of their problems. And I tell the patient, if you don't have a lot of pain, then you just take the 2 paracetamol every 6 hours for a day, and the patients do very well. So, and I think the initial stat dose of the 60 milligrams of the steroid really helps.
Right, okay. So you mentioned that NSAIDs are a good way to go, and
Exactly.
you generally prefer paracetamol, etc. And then there are some other combinations too, that there's nifenamic acid and also an NSAID. So yeah, I think that those things are important. Generally, pharmacological understanding is very important for dentists, because this is where we feel like we're not very well versed, especially if a patient comes with some special conditions. I think now we're more habitual to deal with, for example, women who are pregnant, or people who have a heart condition or something going on with their kidneys. I think we're able to filter out medicines that way. But as soon as something more complicated comes, or a patient already has a very extensive drug history, perhaps we're not very well versed with understanding how drug interactions work, etc. So yes,
That is absolutely important. Like now, it's not that a lot of times patients, when they'll come, they're pregnant, and so a lot of dentists say that no, you can come after the delivery.
Oh.
Now you don't have to that, because you're pregnant does not mean that there is a contraindication to do certain procedures. So why let that patient suffer till she delivers the baby, then she gets more involved with the baby,
Exactly.
Feeding the baby and taking care of their problems.
So the reason why clinicians say it, do you think it is more about feasibility for the patient, or because she cannot lay down for too long?
You see,
or-
the trimester number 3 is the best trimester because yes, they are uncomfortable, but you want to relieve them of the pain.
Of course.
The middle trimester is ideal for the treatment, but you see then also again that radio, you want to avoid X-rays. Now, but it does not, so you want to avoid a panoramic X-ray, but you can do a double lead apron and do an X-ray in their third trimester. Everything is already developed and, but you don't want a patient to suffer.
Oh yes, definitely, that's very important.
We have patients who come to us who are on aspirin. I mean, it's routinely, many patients are on aspirin. Personally, I'm a very non-aggressive operator, so I don't like to do huge heroic procedures. I don't do a lot of cutting and stuff, so I'm very conservative in my extractions. I do try to do atraumatic procedures, so I don't stop aspirin. And I will make sure that after the procedure, you will make sure that you use good pressure pack. And but yes, if the patient is on aspirin plus another blood thinner like Xarelto or Plavix and stuff, then I would like to talk to that physician. I tell the patient, you ask your physician that you want do this procedure, and what if we can stop it for a few days.
Right. A very important thing you mentioned was that you would like to talk to the other physician too, right? This is the interdisciplinary communication in dentistry that is very important, especially with other people. So do you think it is usually easy to get in touch with other physicians in Pakistan like that?
It's very easy because especially if the physician knows, you develop a relationship with them.
Okay.
And so eventually when the patient comes and they bring you the name of a physician who you've never met. So I write a small, very polite note about the procedure, explain to them. I write my phone number down and I will say, if it's okay, you can call me and give me your further guidance. And usually they will, because they are also this is for the benefit of the patient.
Bilkul.
So, sometimes they send a note back that it is fine, stop it for 7 days or whatever. Patients on diabetics.
Many times, I was going to ask.
Yeah, many times patients, are scared. Oh, I have diabetes, I cannot do this procedure. Exactly. That's again another myth. So you have to find out what is their HbA1c, and then you take it from there. If they are controlled or not controlled, what kind of procedure you're going to do.
Right. So I have usually found, Dr. Dennett, at least in my experience so far, which is very limited, that patients tend to also get annoyed a little when they are asked to, hold on at least till the conversation we have had a conversation with their physicians, or at least till they have lab results. For example, you said HbA1c ki report aaja, etc. It's very inconvenient for them. They would much rather go to a dentist who's inappropriately communicating to them कि जी सब हो जाएगा. So how do you communicate with such a patient and let them know that the wait is for their better?
It's very true. Like a lot of times, I'll give you an example. Like a lot of times, patients come and they have a grossly bombed out tooth for many months or years. Okay, suddenly he comes and says, "I want to have it extracted, and I want an immediate implant in an upper first molar or whichever tooth." I'll tell them, and there is an infection, periapical radiolucency and stuff. So I tell them that I would recommend that we first do the extraction, clean up your socket, and see, and then do. Why I do that? Because they said, no, Dr. X said that, no, he will extract and put. I said, yes, if he is confident, I would suggest that you return back to that dentist. Why did you come to see me? They came to see you because they were not 100% satisfied. And I am very picky and in all my cases, whatever I do. So if I find that a tooth is not restorable, I will not advise the patient to get it root canal treated. Because when you do the root canal, they've spent so much money and you cannot crown the tooth or restore the tooth.
Then what's the point?
What's the point? So this is why I have a high success rate because I pick and choose my cases. Similarly for implants, I will not put an implant if there's an infected socket or not. So I have a high success rate. I play it safe because these are all expensive procedures. In our country, we don't have insurance. So the patients are all paying from their pocket.
Yeah.
So after spending much cost for the root canal, for the crown, for the prosthesis, then you tell them that now this has failed after 2 months or 3 months, or it cannot be restored. It's not very fair for the patient.
Absolutely, and this is a very important point that you have addressed, that we keep on talking about how patient needs to do this, patient needs to do that, but it is equally important to understand that the way we are going to be fair or unfair to the patient is what is going to lead to the success of the procedure, and also it's going to lead to whether or not they trust us enough to come back next
Exactly.
time or refer us to somebody else. So one of the practices of dentists, coming back to managing pain via drugs, one of the practices of dentists unfortunately is that even though antibiotics, like you said, can be useful in some areas and under some conditions, but it has become a routine practice for dentists to just prescribe antibiotics like candy. एंड एक तो वो वाला पार्ट है ना कि पेशेंट्स बगैर पूछे खुद
जाके खरीद लेते
हकीम बन के जो है वो ले आएंगे एक एजिथ्रोमाइसिन का पत्ता और खा लेंगे उसको पूरा का पूरा. बट और फिर कभी कभी ऐसे खतरनाक बातें कर रहे होते हैं आके, मैं 2 महीने से खा रहा हूँ. मतलब क्या खा रहे हैं 2 महीने से एजिथ्रोमाइसिन? लाइक oh god, I want to bang my head on a wall. But then doctors also do this sometimes. Okay, for every after every routine procedure, they are going to write an antibiotic just in case. How would you comment on that?
No, because you see, again, you have to know the kind of procedure for which you are recommending. Some patients, some procedures, you don't need an antibiotic. Just
Exactly.
a good analgesic, a good anti-inflammatory will take care of the problem.
Right.
So, but if you feel that there is an infection or and the patient
Something
is
severe,
then
yeah.
only you prescribe, and you have to explain to the patient. And I'm glad now at least there are areas now when you go to the pharmacies, they are bringing in that you cannot just walk ahead and go and take a prescription. Many pharmacies have said, Doctor Sahab, aap hame prescription bhej dein.
Okay,
You know,
okay.
And so because here, people living in the West, they'll say when you're coming, aap hamare liye Augmentin le aaye, ye le aaye, wo le aaye. Now there are the Sindh, I think, commission is being
The
a
Drug
little
Regulatory Authority.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. वो जो over the counter medicines हैं वो रिवाइज होती रहती हैं और बिल्कुल होनी भी चाहिए. I think over the counter medicines की तादाद जितनी थोड़ी कम होती रहे उतनी ही बेहतर है. Because why? लेकिन पता है डॉक्टर ने इससे एक मसला थोड़ा सा exaggerate भी होता है. वो मसला ये है कि जैसे आपने mention किया कि a lot of people are not able to afford dental procedures because dentistry is an expensive
commodity
field, absolutely commodity. So now when a patient wants to also get their toothache relieved, can also not book themselves to a dentist, at least not immediately, or at least is waiting for their next paycheck, etc. So can you suggest how a patient should at least use some basic medications on their own that does not harm them in the long term too, and takes care of the situation for meanwhile?
You see, I would just tell them to take a paracetamol or a painkiller, and anything beyond that, you have to see the dentist, or
Right.
you have to take professional help. You go
Right.
to your general physician. Why are we just talking about dentistry? Like, when they have bukhar, so they are going to see a physician. So it's not that they are not going to see. If they have a bad stomach, they go to see a physician who will then put a drape or whatever. So same thing with dentistry. Why shouldn't they say, okay, I just want to take a painkiller or take some medicine and try to treat it themselves? That's
Right.
not the same.
Absolutely. So, have you ever had a case, Dr. Nanette, in which the patient had such low pain threshold that even during the procedure it was beyond impossible to manage it for them? And how do you differentiate whether or not this patient is just complaining of pain due to anxiety or some psychological phobia, or if my lidocaine actually is not working today? How do you differentiate between these two?
I think it's a matter of experience as well, that you can identify these patients. Sometimes, they'll say that the patient is acting. A lot of times they go, oh, the patient is crazy, and I always used to tell them that, no, we have to respect. The patient is having pain, there is a reason. So like when you're trying to do a root canal, you gave the block, it didn't work. You ask the patient is numb on the lip, the patient is numb, half the tongue is numb. But yet when you're drilling, it hurts the patient.
Okay, what to do?
So in that case, I would always, you give them intraligamental.
ठीक है.
Okay, अगर वो उससे भी नहीं आ रहा है, तो you give them intrapulpal. So you tell the patient, you will just feel one sharp pain, just try to expose a pinpoint exposure, inject inside. And then, of course, that will relieve the patient right away. And they will be comfortable during an extraction when you're doing. Sometimes, you have given a good block, the patient is unconscious, then you try to give some anesthesia right inside the socket, preparing an implant procedure during osteotomy, and suddenly the patient's complaining of pain. Now, when you're doing an implant, like I never give a block. I always give infiltration, okay? So, and why? It's very safe. You don't need to give a block. You really don't need. People don't believe it, but it's true that when you're doing an osteotomy, whether upper, lower, whichever, posterior, anterior, you don't need to give a block. And it's sometimes hard to believe, but that's true.
Okay.
But then sometimes the patient still complains, I'm having pain. Okay, if you're in the first molar region, second molar region, then I will put my depth gauge. I take an X-ray just to make sure where I am. If I feel that the inferior alveolar canal is way down below, I give a little local anesthesia right inside the socket.
Okay, so your reason of not giving a block during osteotomy for implant
that you
procedures?
Want to know it's safe,
right?
Because if you've given a block and if you're very close to the nerve or in the nerve,
you won't know.
You don't know, and then you land up with other consequences. So you want to play safe, and that's what I do. I never give a block.
Right.
You don't need it.
I'm so glad we landed on this discussion, because such an important point came in front of us. Dr. Annette, I had a wonderful discussion with you, and I'm so happy that we were able to explore so many areas in such a short time. I just want to conclude on two things. I want to get your perspective on a patient problem and then a dentist problem. Okay. The patient problem I want your perspective on is how do you suggest a patient takes care of multiple restorations at the same time in their mouth, right? Especially if many of them are amalgam too. And generally patients get very nervous especially with the literature present today and whatnot, and amalgam being constantly replaced by composite. People have started to get very worried about their 6 or 7 fillings that are amalgam based. Would you like to debunk this myth a little for our patients?
Okay, to be very honest, you see, yes, there was a big hype about amalgams and Alzheimer's and all these other issues. Sometimes, yes, it is related. It's very individual to the patients. I have seen myself patients who had lichen planus with a lot of amalgam fillings, and when you replace the amalgams, their lichen planus was almost gone. So you see that. But in general, if you see the massive, in UK, you would see they would be doing prophylactic amalgam fillings. You see these patients with huge fillings, amalgam fillings. Now, you have to be very careful. I never advise the patient to remove the amalgam and replace them for composites for cosmetics. The patients will say, "Bura lagta hai." It's at the back, it doesn't show. And also, it is more hazardous removing that amalgam.
Absolutely.
Then you must have a very high-speed suction, and you have to make sure you collect all the amalgam, then disposing that amalgam. So I tell the patient that whatever mercury had to be leached out has leached out into your body. Now, whether that amalgam filling stays or not is another issue. It really of no consequences, but there are different schools of thought. So that's my school of thought. So I don't encourage patients to remove, because once you've removed the amalgam, then then asking for composites. Now, no matter how good your composites, sometimes they don't last forever.
Of course.
They break, the bonding has a problem, and the contacts have a problem. So then the patient says, my old filling was much better, was 40 years old, and now with this amalgam, it keeps
in
coming
3 months
out.
It's out.
Yeah, with this composite, it keeps coming out. So it's a different way. And you don't want to crown all these teeth, of course, either.
Of course, that was the point I was coming towards.
So you don't want to do that aggressive procedure के composite डाल के you want to crown them, So that's
जिस दांत को बचाने के लिए फिलिंग की थी, वो उसी दांत की अब जो है शामत आ गई है.
So you have to address patients from the perspective of the patient, but yet give them scientific evidence and tell them what is good and what is not good.
Right. So thank you for answering that, Dr. Annette. For a dentist perspective, I have 2 questions. One is that your example is actually, and generally your career pathway is very interesting, because you chose you got a non-clinical degree on top of a clinical degree, and then continued clinical work, and also contributed to education at the same time, right? So you were wearing a lot of hats all the time. I want you to comment on the practicality of wearing so many hats to people who want to be engaged in different things, but then they fear that it might come at the cost of their clinical skills.
I feel that you can do, you have to know how to weigh and be multitask. But see, at the end of the day, we are clinicians. We are a dentist. So we have to be a good dentist first, no matter whichever line we follow. So even as a clinician, I remember, I cannot forget when I was in my process of my postgraduate education, and I came to see the dean at the Aga Khan University, Dr. Shevis Smythe, and he said, and I was talking all about public health and this strategy, and he says, Ninette, the first thing you have to realize that you have to be a good dentist. If you're a good dentist, people will believe in you. People will trust you, and whatever you want to do later will all fall into place. And I still remember his words. So whatever we do, if you're good as a clinician, we can work and take it from there. But yes, there are some people who don't have a hand of a dentist. They did dentistry, but they are not meant to be dentists. So I don't encourage them to continue. If they want to go in for any other role, then that's fine. It is something, it's an art and science. If you can't combine it, then you should, though you went through the whole process, but it's good to give up. Right. And then I also feel the other thing that, sometimes we feel that, we want to do, because we all have to earn a living, right? We all have to survive. Bilkul. We all need money. But I feel that whatever is written for me is for me. It's not going to go to another person, no matter what. So I just feel that that's not a reason why you would not do a procedure, or you would do a procedure just for the money.
True.
If I am destined to get that money, no matter what, it will be the patient, I will get the money, no matter how, through treatment or through programs or education. So I think that is something you have to also have faith in.
Right. So your comment on always be a good dentist before anything else drives me to my second and last question, actually, and that is, I want you to emphasize on the importance of learning how to manage pain for a patient before anything else, and generally giving it importance to relieve this क्या बोल सकते हैं difficult situation for the patient, because patient को नहीं पता कि आपको कैनाल नहीं मिल रही, patient को नहीं पता कि आपकी रूट फंस गई है, patient को बस ये पता है कि मुझे बहुत दर्द हो रहा है. So I think this is one of the primary reasons why we even started this series, so that dentists can understand why is it important to deal with pain. It's like more than it is important for you to deal with any other kind of complication the patient would have.
See, we all have, there's a large number of patients who don't seek help because of fear. And then when they come to you, it's beyond restorable or beyond. So you see, I think it is a matter of psychological management as well to the patient, as well as giving them the comfort to do the procedure. Yes, we all run into problems like a root fracture, or you cannot find the canal. But then again, you have to learn whether, and also you have to be honest to the patient. You see? So if you tell the patient that, you see, I cannot find this canal, let me get a colleague and help me, let us see where it is, or the root has fractured, let me get an oral surgeon who can help us, So that's something that then the patient will trust you. The patient will know that this has happened. Sometimes we are doing a procedure and the patient, and you did an instrument got separated in the canal. Sometimes if you tell the patient, oh, I've broken an instrument, and the patient will get psychologically, they will get so disturbed, pin toot gayi daant mein.
Oh God.
And they feel that it's going to travel into the circulation and reach the brain. So, but there is a way of explaining to the patient, because you don't want them to go to the next dentist, and the dentist will make it so drastic and it's finished, right? So I think it is how you manage the patient, how you explain. You'll see that we have a file which has been separated, but that's not an issue. I will ask my endodontist to address it, and you have to deal with that.
You have to deal with that. Yes. Don't leave the patient to deal with it on its own.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Or let another dentist deal with it in a way that makes you look so bad later on.
And it is also upon dentists to cut other professionals some slack.
Unfortunately, that's a big issue that we have, and I think we are getting better on that.
Hopefully,
we're getting better
inshallah.
on that.
Anyway,
Inshallah.
thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ninit. It was wonderful talking to you. It is always wonderful talking to you, but this was a very good conversation, because otherwise we only see you in conferences when you're a speaker or at a seminar or something, and it's kind of hard to get in touch with you. But I hope that anybody who watches this has learned more than they did, knows more walking out of this podcast than they did previously. Inshallah. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Just my one last message that,
Yeah.
see, we have one life to live, and we all have to aim to be in the top 1%. So we all have to work towards that.
Absolutely, inshallah. So this was our time with a very excellent clinician who has been into so many dimensions and so many areas of dentistry, and hence is able to comment so well on so many aspects of dentistry. She is always very approachable and very accessible, and considers her patients her topmost priority, which is the reason for most of her travel as well. Thank you for watching. You've been a great audience, and see you in the next podcast. Allah Hafiz.